My name is Jeremiah, and I am going to talk today about what is considered to be one of the best movies of the 2000s. A movie that we've probably all seen, called No Country for Old Men. First of all, there's a lot that can be said about the film to begin with. One thing is that it is a standard cat and mouse thriller in which a cowboy finds a shootout due to a drug deal gone wrong. When he takes the money, he goes back and finds out that people have returned and want the money. They use his license plate to track him down, and such begins the cat and mouse game of getting the money back. You like my mug? It's not Christmas time, but I keep it in the spirit. But it is far more complex than that. It's a Cormac McCarthy novel. His novels are usually pretty bleak. I have not read the novel, although I do have it, for fear that it would be too bleak and I would want to blow my brains out. So, based on that, I've decided not to actually read the book. I had the great pleasure of watching The Road, which is really one of the most depressing movies ever made. That is also one of his books. I recommend that if you're in a bad mood, please don't watch it. It gives you nothing. It is what we call in script writing a down, 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 down story, which means that you never go up, which is, I don't know about Cormac's style. I do think that he is bleak and he's trying to find hope, maybe existential hope, but I can tell you that it's not a truly effective way of writing, because at least what you'll want to do is give an up part and a down part and an up and a down, down and up, kind of keep it interesting. If it's all bleak and nobody really cares, and you're depressed, you may be able to pull in a small amount of audience that really just loves depressing films. I don't know anybody personally, but I'm sure that those people exist. But regardless, let us move on from The Road and talk about No Country for Old Men. No Country for Old Men is existential, there's no doubt, and it talks specifically about good and evil. The opening is the sheriff, Tommy Lee Jones, talking about, the past, and then a little bit about the present, about how he was a lawman for a long time, his reasons for being a lawman, which were mostly family related, which plays a huge part at the end as well, and just various other things about being a lawman, the way that you can die in the line of duty, which is indeed a fact. Setting up what would be termed as, I would say, a postmodern Western. There's not really any what you would call postmodern elements to it, in the sense that it's relying on images or trying to think, characters or costuming from other media in order to show the change that has been made. Just to give you a brief idea of what postmodernism is basically, it's kind of like that Campbell's soup painting that Andy Warhol made, which is calling attention to a bit of culture that already exists and presenting it in a new way. Okay, so that's kind of the idea of what postmodernism is. That is not 100% postmodernism, but that's a pretty good idea of what we're talking about. But the film is presented as both a postmodern Western, or maybe what I should say is a Western after the death of the frontier, which would be the frontier of film, which would be about the 70s, when two things happen. One, Blazing Saddles was made, and Blazing Saddles was so grotesque to the Western it was actually insulting to make a Western after that. That's why after that there was barely any Westerns made in the 80s. I can think of maybe 3. Silverado is definitely one. I'm trying to think what the other 2 are, but I can't really remember right now. They just weren't made after that, and they were made in the hundreds before that. So it gives you an idea of how bad it was lampooned in Blazing Saddles. I think in particular, the fart sequence after they've eaten beans is a good indication of what lampooning really went on there. So I'm sorry, I'm just thinking about that, plus a ton of the rest of the movie, which makes me want to talk about that one specifically and how it killed the Western. I don't know if that was actually his intention, the director. Oh my gosh, I can't remember his name. Give me a second. He just hasn't done stuff for years. Oh, it'll come to me in a second, and I'll remember it. But beside the point, that was one thing. And then the other thing that really, really cemented the true end, because even to be lampooned, it will just go away for a while, but to cement the true end was the rise of the space western, which we see now, such as Marvel's canon, or Guardians of the Galaxy is a good example of that. It's basically Star Wars for Marvel. And then, of course, Star Wars, which came out in, I believe, 79, but it may have been 77. I'm not 100% for sure. But both the Blazing Saddles and the Space Western destroyed the Western forever. And instead of expanding in America on the frontier and being self-reliant, and the idea of self, or the heart being the answer to the heart's wisdom, such as John Wayne famously dictated, which was he didn't play by everyone's rules, he played by his own heart's rules. So there's a famous paper on that. You can look it up in JSTOR or wherever if you're actually in college. If you're not, then find someone that is and look up, I believe it's called, I would just type in John Wayne and heart, and it should pull up that particular paper. But regardless, so it killed that, and what we saw after that with a space western is a flashy new design, which was definitely cemented in the 80s, or at least was starting to be formed in the 80s, excuse me, with the rise of the capitalistic film. They call it the film school generation. I would call it the capitalistic film, because the idea was to make now as much money as possible, which is fine. It has its drawbacks, as all things do, but I mean, you're there to make money for the studio, so if they want you to make a movie like that, then you have the privilege of working in that place, so please do. Because I like Marvel movies, I like DC movies, some of them, and so on and so forth. Or Indiana Jones is okay. I definitely like The Last Crusade. Let's see. Jurassic Park. Oh yeah, I forgot about that one. That was a really good one too. Okay, so what we're talking about here is No Country for Old Men. We went off on kind of a tangent there, but that's okay. I hope you learned something. I know I did. So I think we've all learned something here. So we're talking about two forces that are presented here. Actually, three, technically. As in any holy triad, there is a third, or a triumvirate, if you will. It doesn't matter how you look at it. So you have the sheriff, 1, okay? You have the cowboy, 2, and you have the bad guy, 3, okay? I'm going to talk about each individual one, but they will overlap, so just bear with me. One is the sheriff, okay? He was presented as the face of good, ultra good, okay? The cowboy is the middle. He is the kind of the soul stuck between the good and the bad. Okay, and then you have the id, or the bad, or the body, or whatever you want to call it, in the psychopathic killer. Okay, so you have 3 different archetypes here, dueling, so to speak. Okay, and by the end of the film, the good is destroyed. The sheriff is destroyed, disenfranchised, disassembled, whatever you want to call it. That's really what happened to him. And the soul is dead as well, because the cowboy is killed awkwardly in the film, which I really enjoyed, just as a kind of a throw-off, almost like the whole film was basically a throw-off. It was setting up for this epic battle that never took place, which is why I think that most people, when they talk about No Country for Old Men, are confused about the ending. Okay, not just the dream that he explained in the abrupt cut at the end, but also the whole sequence that led up to that. Because the sheriff was supposed to duel the bad guy, you know, good versus evil, but it doesn't happen. And you're not aware of whether the sheriff knows that he can duel him or not, or even if he's there. It's not really clear. Maybe the book goes into a little bit more detail. I don't know, and I would love to see a comment about that so I could address that. However, for sake of argument, in the film, which is what I'm specifically speaking of, because it is considered to be one of the best films of all time, you have no real resolution to the conflict. And that's what ultimately destroys the sheriff. Okay? He was unable to fulfill his destiny as good to triumph over evil. So you're left with a very bleak outlook, at least on the surface. Okay? There's a couple of things that I want to mention here about the cowboy. Okay? One is that he is extremely earthy, salty, whatever you want to call it. You like him almost immediately, even though he's killing a deer. You don't know why. It's because he is so salty and salt of the earth. Okay? It was written for a specific reason, I'm sure, which was to make the character extremely likable. And because he was going to have to go through various things that would challenge him. Okay? Being the middle range, you're going to have to do both good and potentially bad things. So you have to be likable. That is a required character trait for someone that is like that. But he, of course, threatens evil. There's a sequence where he's on the phone with the killer, and the killer expresses that he wants to kill his wife, and then the cowboy retorts that he's going to kill him with no fear or hesitation. So you can definitely tell that he is built up to be an archetype as well, or at least a criticism of an archetype, depending on how you look at it. I believe that that particular character was actually written to be an archetype. That's just my opinion. I think the sheriff is a criticism. Now, what that criticism is, I can't tell you specifically. I think it's a little vague. It's more in the author's imagination. So I think the criticism is of possibly age and becoming obsolete, because the book's name is No Country for Old Men, which that actual phrase I think dates back to Lord Byron. So this is not something that was pinned for the actual book. And then you have, of course, the evil, okay, the psychopathic killer, who preys on anyone and everyone. There is no one that is sacred to him or off limits. He obviously doesn't kill children or anything like that, but if anyone stands in his way, he will kill them. He pulls over innocent people who just want to assist him on the side of the road, killing them and taking their cars. And he uses a cattle prod to do it, as of course the symbolism is that they're just cattle to him. They're just something to be destroyed without much emotion, of course. So you have all these three archetypes, all right? So let's talk about what really I think is a possible thesis of this particular film, which is to say that evil is not greater than good, okay? I think that's really what the thesis is. Now, it's a very dark message that they're sending because the sheriff is destroyed and he is the ultra good, okay? And evil basically gets away because even though he does get in an accident, he's able to slink off into the darkness. But I think it's more to the point, though, does he? And there's a particular reason I want to say this. When he approaches the wife after the cowboy is dead, and states that he will follow his principles of killing her because he told her husband that she would, or he would. There's some mild dialogue that's exchanged about how she doesn't think that that's right and blah, blah, blah. And he says, yeah, I've always heard that, blah, 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 whatever. Okay, so, but the key of this is that he says, okay, well, I'll give you this. Okay, he bends it. It doesn't bend his principles because he's a very principled evil. He says, I will flip a coin, and if it lands whatever you choose, then you'll live, and if it doesn't, you'll die. And she simply refuses. Okay, so right away you're exposed to the element of chaos. Okay, chaos or unintended consequences or acts of God, or whatever you want to call it. He leaves the house. It's never clear if he kills her. We assume that he does. That he has no choice but to follow through, even though she refuses to participate with him in the flipping of the coin. And as he's driving, he's sideswiped because he clearly has a green light. He's T-boned by another car. Okay, and he receives a compound fracture of his arm. He has to tie it off with a shirt, and he buys a shirt from a kid on a bike with a couple of other kids. And that's really the point of the film, I think. The sheriff being destroyed is, I think, in some ways reminiscent of why Cormac McCarthy is so hard to read, because he's so bleak. It definitely makes for an interesting ending. It's a French ending to just end a film with loose ends that need to be tied up. But there is a sequence why I think this is actually a positive film for the sheriff, or at least the people in the sheriff's life. But going back to the scene where he is in the accident, it basically is a thesis of saying that no matter how much you rob, steal, or kill, you cannot escape the randomness of life that everyone is subject to. Every time we get behind a car, there's a possibility we could be hurt or something like that. Not to be too bleak, but that is a possibility. And we're all subject to that, whether you're good or evil. So there is an element that is completely out of our hands that we would like to refer to as acts of God, that I think specifically is addressed in this film, which is to show that no matter what you do, you are still subject to the same rules and randomness as everybody else. So, to tie this all up, the sequence with the sheriff when he's with his father-in-law, I believe it's his father-in-law, kind of gives another thesis to the film, which is that nobody really knows the nature of life. And that's an important thing to stress, is that we all don't know the nature of life, no matter what we claim or no matter who we claim to be. We all are still figuring things out and still learning. Now, the sheriff ultimately chooses to take that information and basically die. I mean, the dream sequence with his father, where his father is carrying the fire horn, is reminiscent of his father leading him to the next level or the next place. But the sheriff chooses to use that information to fall off. However, we have a choice to use that information for good, to say, even though we still need to find our peace of mind or not. And again, this is all based on a very simple premise, which is a cat and mouse thriller of someone taking money that didn't belong to them and being chased by bad guys. Okay, so I invite you to re-watch the film based on that. Okay, feel free to Instagram me or whatever you want to do. I'll put all that information up right now. This is just one of the many films that I will criticize. I'm going to start a film group if I can. Of course, it would depend on if people want to come, where we watch a film and talk about them. I'm going to talk about guerrilla filmmaking as well, how you can make a good quality film with your camera or whatever you want, because the technology is available now for that. So I thank you for your time, and feel free to leave your comments. Thank you.